You're listening to Freight Famous, presented by Rose Rocket, bringing you the people that make trucking move. From behind the scenes into the limelight. Here's your host, Justin Bailie.
Hello and welcome to Freight Famous, the Rose Rocket podcast spotlighting the brightest minds in the supply chain industry. You heard right, we are changing the intro, so bear with me. At Rose Rocket, we're dedicated to making the supply chain smarter and more connected. Our software helps over 100,000 people, from startups to large enterprises, streamline operations and stay ahead. We're passionate about innovation and expertise, which is why we bring top industry leaders to share their insights with you on Freight Famous. Learn more at roserocket.com. I'm your host, Justin Bailie, co-founder of Rose Rocket. Today, I'm thrilled to have Matthew Leffler, the Armchair Attorney, joining us to chat about non-competes, non-solicits, the most important legal case in transportation today, and why he has a black eye. So sit back and enjoy a front row seat. Matthew, thanks for being here, man.
I cannot tell you how excited I am to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk about this industry that it seems that none of us can actually escape.
Yes, yeah. I was reading in the notes that you have tried, but here you are. We're going to have a podcast on Freight Famous. Not only have you not gotten out of it, you are now officially Freight Famous. So you've even risen above just being in the space.
Right.
I did want to talk about your background a little bit, and there's an interesting story I think with your sort of dad and grandfather. So maybe if we can kind of weave all the way back, and you can bring me up to how you got to sit here with me today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my grandfather, after World War II, he opened up his own trucking company. He lived in central Illinois, Jacksonville, Illinois specifically. And he built up a business hauling grain. And that's a lot of trucking companies, did that. This was back in the 60s, late 50s. And he got up to a place, I believe, where he had about 6 pieces of power. He had a pretty decent sized fleet moving grain in central Illinois. And unfortunately, he got polio. And so he ended up going to the hospital for 6 months, and he lost the ability to walk to an extent, and he went bankrupt and lost the company. My father at the time was probably, 7, 8 years old. And when he got out of the hospital, my grandfather was able to still work in the industry as a mechanic. And so he would service, tractors, like actual tractors, but also trucks. And my dad was always helping him. My dad was, had a mechanical aptitude. And so that's how my father kind of got into this kind of industry. But it wasn't until much later. In 1976, my father graduated from Northern Illinois University, and his very first job out of college was roadway. And there was a time in this country, in North America, where 3 trucking companies moved everything: Yellow, Roadway, and CF, Consolidated Freightways. And Dad was a night shift manager of the Chicago Heights terminal. So he worked nights managing union mechanics. And again, unions were everything back in the day, back before deregulation. And so Dad spent about 15 years with Roadway, moved all across the country. He was in Illinois and Texas and California. He spent about, again, 15 years with them. And then he had the opportunity to work for a company called Airborne. So Airborne, today we know Airborne is DHL, but it was a freight forwarder. It was an airline industry. And he managed maintenance for a lot of the company vehicles and also the operators that also moved the freight for him. But in 1991, this is the critical, really important time, he was approached by a company called RPS, Roadway Package Systems. And RPS was the answer from Roadway for the unionized parcel company UPS. It was, how can we do what UPS does without the liability of all these people and these employees? And my father became a maintenance vendor for RPS. We actually had a facility inside of RPS on their property, maintaining their equipment. Now, no one knows who RPS is anymore. Some people do, but most of us know RPS as FedEx Ground. FedEx Ground is the what Roadway built to answer UPS, and they were effective. That company today is still one of the most profitable and prolific trucking companies and transportation businesses, airlines in the world. And we were, for about 20 some odd years, the largest maintenance provider for FedEx Ground. So I got into this business. I was about 7 or 8. My dad started the company. And I said to myself, I will never go into transportation. The only thing that I really knew about trucking when I was a kid was that it meant my father was gone for over 180 days a year. That's what I knew about transportation. So that's kind of the genesis of how I find myself in this business that you can't escape, because it is all the things. But that's kind of the really beginnings of how I learned this ridiculous and amazing industry.
And then so then fast forward you from 8 to going into university and deciding to study law, and maybe kind of let's go from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was did a little bit further background. So I was a track and field runner. I loved running sprints. Wasn't a distance guy. So I had a scholarship to run Division I track and field, and I was a 400-meter dash guy. So I did one lap, one oval, and then they cut the program. And so I was like, no one really wanted to watch us run an oval. So I transferred to University of Illinois, got a degree in political science with a minor in English, and I realized I wasn't ready to be an adult. And I really had this aptitude for solving very complex problems. I liked the rigidity and flexibility to the same extent of the law. So I went to Michigan State University College of Law, graduated in 2010, magna cum laude, and my first job was in the as a lawyer for private practice working with businesses. Some of them were trucking companies, some of them were construction companies. And over time, my specialty went into the transportation space. I was defending trucking companies in catastrophic accidents. And the worst day for a motor carrier was my Monday, also my Tuesday, happened to be my Wednesday as well. And I kind of figured out the challenge we have as an industry. As a lawyer, I couldn't really solve it. I could deal with the really specific problems that just like, here's the event, let's deal with the event. But really, how do you solve bigger problems in the industry? And that's why I went to work with my father's company. I had spent most of my childhood not really knowing the man. I knew him well enough as a father, but never as a professional. And so for about 6 years, I got to work with my dad. I was the general counsel. I was vice president of business development. We had our relationship with FedEx and SEVA and Old Dominion in Pitt, Ohio. And I got to work with some of the greatest motor carriers that have ever hauled freight. And that's really what kind of got me into going from this legal background, which I still am a lawyer, but into the actual meat and potatoes of transportation, which is maintenance. Is how do you safely deliver freight on time and undamaged? And you do that through very consistent maintenance practices.
And then, so what do you do today? So how would you define kind of your existing career and how you what is your, I know you're a lawyer, but are you a litigator? Or are you speaking specifically on the defense side? Maybe talk a little bit about how you represent the world.
I look at myself today as a legal commentator in my legal capacity. So I have a law firm. It's called Armchair Attorney. Most of what I do with Armchair is pro bono services for people who have non-competes and non-solicits and non-disparagements, all the post-employment restrictive covenants we all hear about all the time. Well, my career is I've been wondering. So after I was at my father's business, I helped orchestrate the sale of the company. And so he retired and I went into working with the surviving entity called Dickinson Fleet Services. I was there for about 1.5 years and then I had a non-competition agreement. So I had to go into software. So I've been in software. I have been in sharing softwares. I've been in service management software. I've done leasing. I've done maintenance. I've done a little bit of everything in the business. So what I do day to day now is I help certain private equity funds source acquisitions. I do a lot of work with talking about legal issues, whether it's on FreightWaves or other my own podcast. And I just try to find problems that interest me, because the worst thing in the world for me is to be bored. I can't survive boredom.
Just very sort of obvious, basic question. How do you get paid to do that work?
So the podcast has a revenue source. I have advertisers who work with me.
Yeah.
In the deal making space, there's usually success bonuses that take place. As a lawyer, I'm very accustomed to charging hourly, which is essentially my time at a 0.25 interval, so at 15-minute increments.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways. Oh, I have a baby crying in the background.
Okay.
I have 4 of them. I have two, an 11-year-old and 8-year-old, and the twins that are 18 months. So yeah, I find a lot of interesting ways. And then oftentimes I work in-house for somebody. Someone will come to me after working with me in the consulting space, say, hey, we'd like you to come on as a full-time employee. So my most recent role was vice president of strategic accounts for a leasing company. But really, I try to find problems that are interesting and companies that see the same kind of value that I do in how the industry is changing over time.
Yeah, that's I wanted to sort of poke at that a little bit, because I'm sure I knew there was multiple ways in which the I don't know, sometimes seeing how the sausage is made is interesting. And then on the 4 kids, I've also got 4 kids, so I'm older. They're not crying in the background in the same kind of way. But twins is the last, is the final. Not saying it's the final, but for number 3 and 4 is a pretty. That's good. That's man's work right there.
Yeah, it's parenthood on the hardcore mode.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I didn't necessarily want that mode, but you know what? We take what we can. But 4 is the max. We've officially tapped out.
It's a good big number. So I guess, like, what are you working on now that's particularly interesting? So you said you hate being bored. So kind of as we've had, the world changes, and you said you've been working in technology, you've been working in all these different areas. What is particularly interesting right now to you? What is it that's catching your attention? And maybe more in a, maybe not specifically, but maybe even you can go as high as, it can be very meta, or there's really something practical and tactical that you think of when I bring that up. But I'm curious on, what are you finding interesting in today's environment?
Well, the thing is that the problems today are not new or novel problems. They're the problems that have been around since time immemorial in our business. So it's never been easy to move freight. Some of the stuff that gets me really interested right now is how we look at labor, how we look at who we employ, how we employ them, and how we control them, for lack of a better word. And I think really specifically about the Federal Trade Commission and their ban on non-competition agreements, and how that's kind of developed and evolved over the last year and a half. I mean, you think about a non-compete, and this is a contract that essentially says you are going to give something to your employer, often for nothing. And that thing that you give them is, in some cases, your entire identity. In America specifically, we put our identity in the thing that we do every day. And when you tell somebody you're not going to get to do what you do for a year or for 18 months or for 2 years, it's an interesting problem. But the question is, how pervasive is that problem? In America, 30 million people, about 1 in 5 working Americans, have a non-competition agreement, which is, again, them giving up something. And we're starting to see businesses pull back on them. We see states regulate them differently. And we see the federal government trying to make challenges to this incredibly pervasive and pernicious contracting pathway of taking someone's rights away. And again, they don't know that they're doing this until it's too late. Most people who sign these things are making under $20 an hour. I mean, it's just, it's crazy how pervasive they are. And that's why I find that topic very, very compelling lately.
So just to dig on that a bit, I'm curious about, okay, so, and this is just from, I'm getting to nerd out a little bit on this.
Let's go down the rabbit hole.
Okay, so if you have a non-competition in your contract that says you basically can't, like in your summary, what are they saying you can't do? Like, actually, let's define what a non-compete actually is.
I love that. So a non-compete is it's a type of, we call post-employment restrictive covenant, a perk, but it's the opposite of perk. But a post-employment restrictive covenant is after you left the job, so post-employment, restrictive, you've taken the liberty and given up something to somebody. Covenant as a contract. So it's a contract where you are offering up something. And what it typically involves are really 3 things. The first one is, how long? What is the duration? How long is this non-compete? Is it 3 months? Is it 12 months? Whatever that number is. Then it says, what is the geographic restriction? So is the restriction my city? Is it my country? Is it my nation? Is it the entire world? Like, what is the restricted territory? And then the last piece is, what is the business that I'm not allowed to do anymore? Like, what is the thing that if I go and do this either for somebody in-house or on my own or whatever, what is the thing that I can get sued for? And that is what it boils down to, is those 3 elements: the time, the geography, and the description of the business. And then there's a question that it's always asked is, what is the legitimate business interest the company has to prevent you from doing these things? And what we now kind of see is really anything can be considered a legitimate business interest. That's why so many people have these things. And then there's other types of perks, like a non-solicitation agreement, which often gets kind of conflated, or a non-disclosure agreement. Those are all types of contracts that say, there's something that you have that I want, and I'm going to make sure you give it to me. That's the real kind of functional aspect of a non-competition agreement.
But if you were to take the non-solicit, which we'll sort of define as very broadly, and again, I come from more the go-to-market side of things, so I think of that as like, taking customers from a business you used to work for and bringing them over
Yeah,
to a new
taking
one.
customers, taking
Right.
vendors, taking
Sure.
employees. Exactly
So
right.
in the absence of that, you're really effectively going to work for, like in a non-compete, in the absence of any solicitation, you are going to work at a competitor or a tertiary, like perceived to be competitor. You can kind of see how this is a pretty challenging and pretty punitive
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
type of language, in that it's like, if you're working for a company, especially if you're making under $20 an hour, the likelihood that you're going to go work for a lateral style company, because that's where your skills have developed and that's what you can do. Like, that's where you're probably going to not, maybe not often, but sometimes at least, broadly go to work. So it's like, I guess in the absence of, and this is a bit of a subjective question here, but like in the absence of the solicitation, what are companies worried about? Like, what's the big deal if you're not taking anything? What do they care? Why do they care?
So that's a really, really good question. I think that the answer will be, it depends based on the company and the advice the company received. A lot of people came to non-competes recently thinking, I have a retention issue. I can't keep my people. And the best way to keep them isn't to improve the working conditions or the compensation or the benefits. The best way to keep them is to threaten them with the entire apparatus of the legal system. And when someone thinks that you're involved in a competitive business after you've signed this, there's a very specific path that happens. The first thing that happens often is a cease and desist letter. It's a letter sent to you and your new company saying, we believe you're violating this contract. And if you don't stop immediately, we're going to sue you. So when that letter is received, 90% of the time, maybe 99% of the time, that company that hired you just now fires you immediately, because they're also subjected to a potential lawsuit called a tortious interference claim. So you can basically say, as the old hiring entity, hey, you're competing with me and you're helping him compete, and you are also going to get sued for this. So what is it they're trying to protect? This is the really interesting question. Generally speaking, they're trying to protect anybody from taking their talent. So they're starving their competitors from people that are talented that can solve that problem. They're also stopping, to an extent. I mean, it is what it says it is. It's a non-competition. I don't want competition. I don't want you to even open up a shop to compete with me. I don't even want to have to think about you. And it's so interesting in the fact that almost every employment relationship in the United States is at will. I can fire you because it's Tuesday or Monday. It doesn't matter. As long as it's not a protected reason, you're gone. But the employer still wants to control you. You're not going to go see or be with anybody who's like me. And if you do, I'm going to sue you. So we have this weird dichotomy of employers that are job creators and all these great things, but they're also incredibly fragile. The fragility of these companies thinking, oh my gosh, Ben is going to go compete with me, or Tom is competing with me. I need to sue them. The history of these things is far, far darker than what we see today, but they come from this very, very interesting place of, how do I control somebody after they leave me? And that's what these things are all about.
They need a big group read of Blue Ocean, and everyone would be totally okay. Like, it's, this idea that you are, like how you said it, like the way that we're gonna retain our employees through legal apparatus and intimidation. I mean, this sounds like the turn of the century. This sounds like this is 20th century style, like manufacturing. This is very cronyism almost at its kind of core.
You're exactly right. And you've actually scratched the exact thread that I want to pull, which is, where did these things really become pervasive in America? Now, we think of non-solicitation agreements today as me, as a former employee, calling on my former customer or calling on my former coworkers. That is not what non-solicitations were after the Civil War. Non-competes began in earnest in America after the Civil War concluded. What happened was a bunch of freed men and women now became employees or contractors for their former masters, the former plantation owners. And those plantation owners would force them to sign non-competition agreements that said, if you now work for me, you may not sell your labor anywhere around me. So if you're going to get a new job, you have to move. And that is a new kind of way of taking a non-competition agreement. The non-solicitation agreements, the old days, hundreds of years ago, they were not about what you would do individually. They were non-solicitations of other businesses coming to your workers and saying, hey, I'll buy your labor for more than you're making here. And they banned those in the South. Now, that was a lot of litigation. Those are found to be unconstitutional, but you can see what happened. There was a time in our country where labor was something that was free. You had to pay for room and board, housing, whatever, but you would have this control. And once the control went away, they had to find another thing. And that's what non-competes really are. They're a vestige of the Civil War and slavery back in the day. That's what they have evolved from. And so when people ask me about like, well, it's a person and a business having a private contractual negotiation, and it's designed to protect the business and to a lesser extent protect the worker, that's absolutely incorrect. These are things that were designed initially by lawyers to make sure that I could control somebody after they leave my employ, and ultimately lower the cost of wages for everybody else in the area. That is why they're so pervasive everywhere in this country, in every single industry, not just transportation. It's everything.
This is super interesting. So I'm going to just keep going because I'm just curious, and I'm probably hijacking the show for my own personal interests. So
that's the way to do it, my friend. Yeah, this is your show. Let's do
exactly. Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, let's do a scenario here and I think in post-pandemic world, this is I can work for a company based and headquartered in Chicago today, and then I can go work for a company based in San Francisco tomorrow quite easily from where I sit right now. These laws you mentioned before are I guess, governed and regulated at a state level. Is that what you had said?
Generally speaking, that's correct. They're all state level stuff.
So what happens if I'm in a state that has a particularly egregious level and good sort of history of, call it, employer rights towards these non-competes, and I move to, and I do know because of my history in California that it's a pretty pro-employee culture there.
Yes.
And so what happens if I move to, say, California from a state that is particularly, sort of opposite to that from the balance of that? Who governs that non-compete in that situation?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is what I talk with so many people about. So the non-compete, the contract itself will often, and I would say often meaning always, but lawyers, we never use definitive things, but oftentimes they have a thing called a choice of law clause. So the contract says, no matter where you live, what you do, the law that we're going to apply on this contract is Ohio, or is going to be Texas. Yep. Now, California, to your point, has been very adamant. They find all non-competes, virtually all non-competes, illegal against public policy. They will never enforce them in California. But that's not how this works. What typically happens is, again, most states allow non-competes. So let's be very clear. Like 80, 90% of all states have perfectly okay with non-competition agreements. And what will typically happen is, let's say you live in Chicago, your company's based in California, or maybe it's near California, and then the choice of law is in Ohio. Whose law applies? Well, typically what happens is you're sued in Ohio because you've consented to be sued in Ohio, not knowing like what that contract was that you had 2 days to review. You're bound by Ohio law, even if you don't even live in Ohio. And then once they sue you, either you're going to get a default judgment or you're going to hire local counsel to fight for you in Ohio. The cost of a lawyer, most people don't deal with lawyers every day. I am one. I talk with lawyers. A lot of my friends are lawyers. It's between, let's say, on the low end, $300 to maybe high end $700 per hour for a lawyer to help you. And in litigation, like in trial or before trial, you might be spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a month. And that's out of pocket. That's out of pocket. And so what ends up happening is, because every state is different, every state has different ways of looking at the choice of law provisions, it's really a roll of the dice as to how these things happen. You can move to California and say, go pound sand. You can't touch me. And they're going to say, fine, that's okay. We made you move. But when with the remote work that happens today, they now say it's going to be the geographic restriction is not where the company's headquartered or where the office is. It's your house. And they'll say you can't do anything like you're doing now in 30 miles of your house. And you say, well, I spent the last 15 years doing my craft. This is what I do. That sounds like your problem, not a my problem.
So it's where you're served effectively is where this would. So is that, or where you live? These are two
it's where so the contract will define where the geographic restriction is. But every single work from home environment I've ever encountered, the way they define the geography is where you live and where the corporate office may be or the satellite office nearby. Effectively, it requires you to leave the business or leave into an adjacency that doesn't violate the non-compete, and then you move if you want to really do your craft.
What is a typical duration of time that would be? And you said it's kind of all over the place, but is there a 3-month window that would be more typical, or 6 months or something?
Yeah,
like that?
no one's gonna be mad about a 3-month.
Right.
They're very rare. Most non-competes tend to be at a minimum 6 months and at the high end 2 years. That is generally considered reasonable in most states. Now, it's important to note you're not paid by your former company during this period. You're given nothing. Senior level folks like the C-suite that has a non-compete that think they're not as dangerous as we talk about them here, they are paid. They're paid a year or 2 years to sit out. Those non-competes are a different kind of category that we see. But yeah, it's 6 months to 2 years. That is pretty typical for the non-competes. And that's for anesthesiologists. That's for doctors. That's for anybody but lawyers. We've exempted ourselves from non-competes.
I do want to comment on the hourly rate on lawyers. I've recently been having to work with a tax lawyer, and I will say, for the record, they exceeded your high watermark on hourly rates. So inflation is real, even in law, folks. So the
tax is a specialty, man. You want to have the best. That $1,000 to $2,000 an hour, no one's going to bat an eye at that. 2,000 they might.
That's what they said. Yeah, that sounds like. That sounds like the narrative. So just jumping on this, then talk about a little bit about non-solicit, because they do tend to often go. I think you said it earlier. They can kind of be mistaken for one another. And how do, maybe just broadly, like how do states? What's your experience more with non-solicitations, and maybe just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So this is a really good topic to differentiate the non-solicit from the non-compete. So non-compete, we established, it's a business description for a term within a geographic area. The non-solicitation is another contract. It's another perk, a post-employment restrictive covenant, but its requirements are a little bit different. They still have the same temporal duration. So is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? There's still a time element. Geography is not there. There is no geographic requirement. It is specifically about 3 categories of entities. And the entities that are talked about with a non-solicitation are your suppliers. So think of the vendors. You can't go call on the vendors. Your customers, you can't go call on the customers, and the employees, you can't go call on your former coworkers. So it's a restriction saying, hey, go do what you want to do. But if you talk to any of my people that you met while you were here, you're going to get sued. And the enforcement mechanism is functionally equivalent. It is a cease and desist letter followed by an injunction with a lawsuit threatened to both you, the worker, and your new company that hired you. So it does still offer some kind of chilling factor, but it doesn't stop you from doing what you were trained to do. The other part, which is really important to note, is that it doesn't control what other people do to you. So if you go hang your own shingle and your favorite customer says, hey, I saw that you changed jobs, I'd like to continue working with you, that is not solicitation that is banned by a non-solicitation agreement. It is only, hey, buddy, I'm over here now, come work with me. And what people kind of forget, and I want to always emphasize this because this is advice that never goes out of style. Anything you do or say in social media or the internet is discoverable. If you send a DM to somebody and say, hey, I'm over here now, give me a call, I will find it. I will subpoena, like, as a lawyer who's trying to enforce a non-solicit, I will find anything that you've done. I will subpoena your cell phone records. I will subpoena your social media records. I'll subpoena the search engines that you utilize, and you can't stop me. Like, I go to that company, not to you, to get that information. So it's really important people understand, like, the level of sophistication of the modern day law world. So if you think you need an attorney, you absolutely do need an attorney. And nothing I'm saying here is legal advice or meant to establish like an attorney-client relationship. But people need to be aware, if you do solicit and you've signed a non-solicitation agreement, you could be caught and you could have a lot of problems as a result of soliciting when you think, oh, I just sent them a text, I just sent them a call.
Yeah.
Get them to come to you. You don't reach out to them.
Yeah, so I will, just for an antidote, I've been through this. So I had started when I first got into freight brokerage, I worked for a company and then I started my own. This is very common, this happens. You build a book of business and you say, and I will actually give some business advice here to people who, because someone listening to this has done this, and so either relate or I'm warning you. I never made as much money as I did working for somebody else. And when I started my own business, my mind, I was like, oh, I can keep all the profits. It's like, I promise you it doesn't work that way. And I've never made that much since. But anyway, I started the business and it was 2011. And so there wasn't the level of sophistication around social media and these types of things where you could track that back. And then I did have a group of customers that wanted to come over to what we were doing. But the reality is, and I think we're kind of past statute limitations here. I did receive a cease and desist letter, basically ignored it. It went away. That was kind of the end of it. It was the advice. There wasn't really much enforceable around what I was doing. I'd kind of covered it. But when I was leaving, I did have to, in order for me to have confidence in standing up the business, I had to have some conversations to say, hey, like, I'm going to be doing this thing. Would you be open to, coming and working with me instead? And having to get there, sort of commit before I actually pulled the trigger to kind of cover that. And this is happening all the time out there. And so going from sort of an agent in that model to an employer later, because now I own, companies and I don't know, man, I kind of get it from both sides. Like I in one way, I don't want to, as an employer, restrict people from being able to compete, or, I'm a big advocate. As long as you're creating, you're never competing. Competing doesn't worry me. But at the same time, it's like, you work hard and spend a lot of money to build a business and attract customers and do marketing and do service and to have that kind of go away. But I don't know, man, like there's other side that says, shame on me if the customer was such that they could just like that the whole value of our relationship was predicated on a single personal relationship. Like there's kind of this, like, how do you even like, you got to look in the mirror a little bit on those,
I think you're exactly, and this is the whole point of everything I do in social media, whether it's on TikTok or Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. I try to add interesting things, but this issue of labor, non-competes, non-solicits, it's not targeted necessarily at people who have them. Like I'm a worker, I have a non-compete, I have to deal with this. It is really targeting, in my mind, business owners to have that very difficult conversation, either internally or with their senior leadership team, saying, what is it that makes us special? Is what makes us special how we deliver award-winning, amazing service to our customers? Or are we really just a bunch of cards stacked together and you remove one card and it falls apart? There are so many companies that fall into this pathway of thinking, I can solve retention issues with a non-compete and a non-solicit, and I can protect myself. I can hedge my risk away. But the challenge that happens, and this is what I think is invariably the case, is if you're a business owner and you put those things in place, you are now spending a portion of your time looking backwards, looking around at things that don't matter to you or your customers. If your value of retaining a customer is because of Steve and Steve leaves, that's a problem that you can solve as a business owner. So in my opinion, and this is why I think I get controversial, I will do whatever I can to make non-competes go away. The FTC's proposed ban, or their final rule banning them, will fail. It will not be successful based on how our Supreme Court's made, how the Fifth Circuit operates. It's not going to be enforceable. The only thing you can do is educate employees not to sign them, and then to educate employers and say, look, every state is coming for you. Like, just to give you an example, in the state of Illinois, if you give someone a non-competition agreement or a non-solicitation agreement, you must legally give them 14 days to review it. You have to have special disclaimer language in that contract. If you don't, it will be invalidated. It will not be successful. And that's one state. They're all doing this. So do you want to have a compliance attorney just saying, hey, let me look at the new laws on non-competes? Or you want to say, hey, how about we don't worry about it and we just do our jobs?
Yeah.
This is they are the most un-American things out there. And for me, non-solicits are not as dangerous on the surface. But I want to see all of these things go away. If I could, I want them all go away, not to make them banned, but just for people to go like, no, I don't want to sign it. NDAs, I have no problem with an NDA. No problem with NDAs. But non-solicits, non-disparagements, and non-competes, I don't like them. I'm not a big fan.
And I think to your point, like it's such a cheap way to, I mean, it just doesn't seem logical that you're going to build a world-class organization that like delivers value when your ethos are keep your employees through intimidation, basically, right? It's like you're not. That permeates through the entire organization. Like you got to look in the mirror at that business to say, you kind of said something earlier, and I've probably said this a lot on the show, but we haven't recorded it in a while, so maybe this will be fresh content. It's this kind of idea that service is the thing that like holds us together. It's like bullshit. There's really no like service is a promise of it's a promise to be delivered after the fact. And so you don't acquire new customers because we're going to be better at service. It's like it's subjective. It's something you can't sell ahead of time. So I think all of this just sounds like I think the way you're thinking of it, it's like you want these companies to drop it, and it sounds like if you're just listening to this, you're like, oh man, this guy's like really pro employee, and he sounds like a liberal and all these things. But it's like you could also say that this is actually helping your business to take this advice because you now do not have this cheat code that you think to try to like. Now you have to think critically about your business, think critically about your culture, think critically about delivering value to the market, value to your employees, value to your vendor, where your customers don't want to leave, your employees don't want to leave. They're there on their own free will. This is actually helpful for you as a business to think along these lines.
You're exactly right. I mean, if my father had a company of over 130 people, we didn't have non-competes or non-solicits. We would never conceive of those things because at the end of the day, if you don't want to be here, I don't want you here.
Yeah,
I don't want you here.
Exactly.
If you want to leave and do something different, go do it. I'm not going to stop you. If you can steal my customers away from me, what's wrong with me?
100%.
Like I have to live with this. So I'm with you. I think like I don't want people to think at the end of the day, everyone has the choice to make these contracts. The challenge that most people face is they're given not enough time to look at the document. And if you're working with a tax attorney, they're busy. Labor guys are busy too. I can't look at your document for 3 weeks. And if you are given 2 days to review it, you're not going to be able to do it. And in the United States, if you have, if someone comes to you and says, I need $500, more about half the country could not get you $500 in 24 hours.
Right.
No one can deal with these things. So for me, it's like the businesses are punching down. They have this great amount of power and they're not happy with the power. The unions are mostly gone. There's some that are still strong, but in transportation, they're very much out of sorts these days. So I look at it and go, be a more conscientious business owner. If you want to make a world-class organization, it's not through using legal tactics to intimidate your current workers or your former workers. Because the minute you send a cease and desist to a former employee, they all know what you did. And in our business, these things are like scarlet letters. Like, I'll give you an example. A lot of my clients get a contract or get a non-disclosure. And one of the things in the non-disclosure will say, you must tell us every single post-employment restrictive covenant you have signed and produce that. Now, your non-compete from your former job says, you may not share this with anybody. And you're like, okay, well, what do I do? Let me go call a lawyer. Who gets to see my document? Well, now you have to tell the employer, the new one, hey, here's a copy of the document. Go back to your old employer in some cases and say, we'd like permission to share this document with the new company. And if you get laid off or terminated, your non-compete, non-solicit are still there. They don't go away. So it is this deeply unfair situation. You're putting somebody who has zero capability of understanding what it is they got themselves into until it is way too late.
Yeah. And that's the biggest thing that kind of this is predatory in that I think the end user here is often, just as you said, not sophisticated enough, or even if they are, just broadly, like, do you want to be the one to sit there and say, I'm not going to sign this on your first day?
Yeah.
Like, are you going to do that? Like,
yeah. Oh man, it gets even worse. They'll give you these things 2 months after you've joined the company.
Right.
And you're like, okay, wait, do I get fired now? And the answer is yes. Yeah. You don't sign it, you're fired. Now I've been on teams in my career where some people have them, some people don't. And to your point about this, like, the negotiation aspect. Less than 10% of anybody negotiates a non-compete. They don't negotiate. They just usually sign them. But women and people of color are generally less likely to negotiate offer letters. They just are. Now, that's a fact we have to keep in mind, because when these things are presented and they don't negotiate, they have them and others don't. And it is just like, you think about, like, 30 million people. I'll give you an example of a real non-compete that really does exist that got thrown away later on, but it was with a company called Jimmy John's. Freaky fast, freaky good, but also freaking non-competition agreements. These people gave every worker a 2-year non-competition agreement that would ban them from working at a sandwich shop within 3 miles of any other Jimmy John's location. Now, we don't know if they sued a bunch of people. They really never got to a place where they were doing that, but they made everybody sign it. And that causes a chilling factor. It just makes you not want to risk it. And eventually the state of New York and the state of Illinois sued Jimmy John's and got them thrown out. But imagine that's what happens with the sandwich company. What happens everywhere else? And that's the case. It is everywhere. Absolutely, positively everywhere.
That is way more interesting and that's just a more dynamic conversation than I thought we were going to have around, well, first of all, I didn't know we were going to have it, but when we put in the show notes, it's like, today we're talking about non-solicits and non-competes, but if you listen to this, that's actually super interesting, and your enthusiasm for it really, really helps. So I appreciate that. What other issues maybe, because this is a good way to ask you questions. What other issues are out there that are top of mind for you that you're thinking about?
I really am. People get a little excited when I talk about autonomous trucks.
Let's do it.
I want to really focus on what it means to be an employee, what it means to be a contractor, and what does the future of transportation look like? I loved how we started the conversation with my grandfather and my father, and we see today, because the fundamental story in supply chain, in terms of innovation, the greatest innovation that's ever happened in supply chain, besides containerization, was the model of independent contractors. The idea that you could take somebody and say, I will treat you like an employee. That FedEx ground driver coming to your house does not work for FedEx ground. That Amazon driver coming to your home does not work for Amazon. They are dedicated service providers. These ideas of making contracts to say, you are a vendor, I'm a hiring entity, you're going to do what I say, and if you don't, I'm going to fire you. That was the work that was started after deregulation in 1980. 60% of all truckers, some people estimate up to 70% of all truckers in 1980 were unionized. Fast forward to today, less than 5%. Yellow's dead, Roadway's dead, CF is dead, XPO's alive, Saia's alive, FedEx Ground's alive. And this idea of automation is what I find so compelling. Automation will finish the work that deregulation started. I'm going to talk about a couple of things that happened last year that frame why I think about it this way today. Last year, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration put out what they call a supplemental advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a legal term that says, hey, everybody, we're thinking of doing something. And what they're thinking of doing is they call level 4 and level 5 automation. Level 4 automation is a remote operator, a drone pilot. Level 5 automation is a remote assistant. So you get pulled over, who's going to share the document with the DOT officer? The remote assistant will help with that. And people say, it's so far away. But the challenges are technology and the legal structures, the apparatus. And the fact the FMCSA is now thinking very hard about level 4 and level 5 tells us this is the inevitability. Now, in California, we talked about California earlier, very liberal state, very cutting edge, one of the largest economies in the world, like, Port of Long Beach, Port of LA, you can't move those things. Those are massive. They had a bill that was backed by the Teamsters and backed by OIDA, the Owner Operators Independent Driver Association. And that bill would have required a human being in every autonomous truck, a safety driver, but a human being. Newsom vetoed it. He vetoed it. So the idea that this automation being far away is not correct. It is closer than many think. And actually, there are trucks today in Texas, for example, moving freight with an autonomous truck, there's a safety driver still there. But the thing that I look at, this issue, once that door is open, it never closes.
Mm-hmm.
Once that pathway moves, we have to deal with it. And so for me, this issue of automation, it's affected manufacturers already. You're never going to have more hand packing of pallets. It's going to be robots. It's going to be all these other things. But trucking will be soon. It'll be middle mile. It'll be maybe at the terminals themselves with autonomous spotting trucks. But this is a question of if, not a question of when. And when I think about when, it is far sooner than most people anticipate.
I mean, I'm fully, and I'm biased because I'm in tech and in transportation tech specifically. But certainly, we've seen, I think huge, and I think you're right. Just because you don't see it in front of your face doesn't mean the infrastructure is not being built to support it. Right? And a lot of this is sort of deep in back end. And I think, you use manufacturing. I think that's actually a good example where you have more, constraints, and it's perhaps safer, subjectively, you could say, having forklifts move around versus trucks out on the road. But that technology, as it gets more perfected, really can apply quite easily, and I think it's in, automation in sort of labor, as you think about it, even going beyond autonomous trucks. You think about the, of course we're going to go here, but you think about sort of what that means in terms of artificial intelligence, the applications between machine to machine for shipping it all. You can really, it's not hard to imagine, we often look at a future that we take sort of the lens of what we see today. And so you had made a comment, you said, when highway patrol or whomever it is pulls over a truck and they have to hand the paperwork, it's like, is there a world where there's any humans involved in there? Like, probably not, right? So we kind of take our own, this heuristic of today's world, and we're like, who's the officer going to get the paperwork from when they go up to the robot? It's like, well, their officer's a robot too. And if the system's autonomous, then you don't really need to pull anybody over because they're not actually committing any infractions, because you don't need to worry about, hours of service. These things move like trains, basically. In my sort of view of the future, it's just this rote train that's getting things, to places.
It's a bunch of reasons. Now, you hit it right on the head. So the reality is, we know the cost of trucking. It is the biggest cost in transportation is fuel. Mm-hmm. After fuel, it's labor. After labor, it's the assets, the truck and the trailer. After that, it's maintenance. After that, it's tires and insurance. So we know the big cost. And as long as those costs remain the costs, the innovation will be around those things.
That's right.
So I fundamentally believe in this thing called CASE, connected, autonomous, shared, electric. Connected is the machines talking to each other, the telematics sharing. I look at P44 and Kites and trucker tools and go, that's the connected kind of stuff we're thinking about. Autonomous there was a great quote I heard at Manifest earlier this year, and it was from a senior executive at DHL, and she was talking about the turnover at warehouses, like how many people leave every year, and they have hundreds of thousands of employees. And the number that she said was up to 70% annual churn at a warehouse. And the phrase that she used was so perfect. She said, we need to reduce our dependency on labor. That is the most disinfected terminology to say, we need less people.
Yeah.
We don't want the humans. They complain, they quit. We don't want to have to train them.
Yeah.
And this momentum, I believe in trends and forces, and the trends and forces do not require any of us individually to agree with them. We just need to understand that they exist.
Yes.
And those trends and forces are coming, and they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
And if you can see where the future is in a decade from now, you can build your companies towards that end.
100%. There's this, if we're afraid of it, then we, tend to bury our heads in the sand to say, this is coming. I don't know how to think about it. I'm worried about it. AI has probably been, I think, the biggest psychological threat to people. Whether it is like how that actually manifests is still to be written. But if you think about autonomous trucks, I think that is certainly one. And then you think about AI, and that I think has made a lot of people very afraid, because I think in some ways, I think it's almost like they sort of jumped. It's not like they're in competition. These aren't parallel technologies, but I feel like autonomous trucking has been in the narrative for probably close to a decade now.
Yeah,
absolutely. But it's sort of been slow by comparison to most technological advancements, where AI was like, it was a concept And then ChatGPT arrived and scared the shit out of everybody, basically, right? But I think there's these really, as we kind of recover from that blow, and you kind of get up off the mat and dust yourself off, and you look around, you're like, there's some really, really interesting opportunities here. There's some really interesting businesses that will come from this. And I think, I heard, I'm going to butcher the stats, but it's something to this effect, like 60% of all jobs that exist today did not exist 50 years ago. And we as humans do an incredible job at adapting. We always have, and I just feel like this is not the end, but it's just the beginning of it, sort of a new wave and a new dawn of possibilities. And, I don't know, I can get pretty deep on this one, and specifically around AI, just because there is a future where I see where everything is done, like the human's life becomes so leisurely because all of the tasks that are executed are all done by AI, the things that we don't want to do. And we don't want to be cleaning nuclear reactors. We don't want to be hand keying bills of lading at midnight, So it's like, these are things that can take it off our plate and drive, in this very like utopian sort of way, like drive costs to zero. And really get to a place where it doesn't cost money to do things like that. And again, then I just go into a whole like alternative currency narrative. I'll stay away from that.
This is the kind of stuff we have to think about because, like, to your point, like the technology is going to go there. Like, it is not going to stop, whether it's benign or it's malignant or whatever. We have no idea until we frame it today. And so what the questions we have to ask is, okay, autonomous truck, if it's going to have a collision with somebody, who does it prioritize, the driver or the passengers or the pedestrians? Like, what do you have to do? And these are conscious decisions. But you bring up a really interesting point of like jobs that existed and don't exist anymore. And I like to think about trailers. So if there's one asset class in this industry that just really excites me, it's trailers.
That's where I've never heard that one before. So please, you own that.
The trailers are everything that exists in our supply chain is a proxy for the box.
That's a good point.
The ELD, no. Like, we don't care. Like, the ELD is important for hours of service. Yes. But for freight tracking, it's that box. Yeah. And when my father was at when he was at Roadway, and he had to go out there and say every January 1st, physical inventory of every single trailer you own. Go to customer yards, look at your own yards, say, where is my trailer? Now, you fast forward to the early 2000s and telematics arrive. Skybit's one of the first ones out there. And they could tell you, we know where that trailer is twice a day. It was like magic. It was magic. Now, you look to how things are right now in our supply chain. There's about 5 million trailers bouncing around. Less than 1/3 have any telematics. Now, I'll say this, and this I think is absolutely true. You cannot have autonomous trucks without smart or connected trailers. It's impossible. They have to talk. They have to communicate. And that future of if you had 4 million trailers connected into some sort of a technology system, do you need that extra million? I don't think you do. And we see regulations coming out in the United States like speed limiters. So we're saying, we're going to control the speed of every single truck. You're seeing this encroachment of robots become much easier if everything moves the same. And if every trailer is connected, it makes the freight movement far easier. So these jobs that will be eliminated, there will be many, but the jobs that will be created are mobile trailer inspectors, mobile truck inspectors, because there ain't going to be a driver pre and post tripping that truck if it's driven by a robot.
That's right.
I love those boxes. I love them.
I mean, it's an interesting point. And the more we describe this, and the more, I think about autonomy, even in just like the consumer world around cars, this all just feels like a giant public transit network. It feels like a subway system almost, the way these things move around, where it's rote, it's on schedule, and it's really efficient. When you think of it like that, it's we've got some gaps between where we are and where we want to be. But to your point, I think the overarching point here is the only way this stops is if capitalism is something that we decide is not in the best interest of our countries and we're going to go away from, because we will continue to, as long as you were driving for profitability, you're going to look to achieve growth and squeeze costs. And these do both. And they're categorically, they are massive, monumental impacts on both those. So again, you were saying this, like the driving towards that technology is being funded by the inefficiencies of the space in which we operate. And so it's not going to stop.
Absolutely.
I do want to just get a few points from you before we're running a nice little show here. Your tips maybe. So kind of going just high level here, we're talking to a lot of business owners, a lot of sort of small to mid-sized businesses. What are some things that you're maybe, if you were to say that I'm repeating these 3 to 5 things all the time, what is that sort of broad, we'll speak with a broad brush here. What are kind of some of your maybe key takeaways that in a pro bono format you could help the community with?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing for everybody is don't defer maintenance. We defer maintenance on so many things: our trucks, our trailers, our mental health, our physical health, our businesses. You have to be proactive. And I think if you're dropping oil on that truck every 60 days or every 6 months, whatever your cadence is for PMs, or you're doing trailer inspections every 9 months, you need to do the same things with your contracts. There are so many people, so many entities that I've dealt with over the years that simply are not taking the proactive steps to make sure their handbook is up to date, to make sure that their contracts are enforceable. And these are just simple things that you can do working collaboratively with your people who are fiduciaries, your lawyers and everything. Those are probably the biggest thing for people to do. And then obviously staying on top of the legal trends. I mean, we were going to talk about nuclear bricks. If there's time, I'd love to talk about the case in Texas with Werner Enterprises, because I think that case is the most important transportation case right now in our country, is this case with Werner. And he's got to be on top of it.
Let's do it right now. I think I think within that will be lessons if this is what you say it is. So go for it.
So the biggest case to talk about right now is Werner Enterprises down in Texas. The story is absolutely horrifying, but it's important to bring some of these facts to light. A truck driver with a trainer in the back was asleep. They were on a highway traveling under the posted speed limit, and it was snowing. In the opposite lane of traffic, a pickup truck was traveling. They were going too fast for conditions. That driver lost control, crossed 10 yards of grassy median, and collided head on with the truck operated by Werner Enterprises. One child died, and one child was given some very substantial brain injuries and just other horrifying injuries. It went to trial. And the question was, who is at fault? Who's responsible for this horrifying thing? And the jury came back, and in the jury's mind, the driver of the pickup truck was 16% responsible. The driver for Werner was 14% responsible. That's 30% liability. 70% of the liability for that case was on Werner Enterprises. The judgment in that case was $90 million. And the case was appealed to the Texas Appellate Court, and they were found to still be liable. That verdict was upheld, and the interest on that case put it over $130 million. Now, the facts to keep in mind, why did Werner get found liable for this? Part of it had to do with the driver who drove the truck had only been doing it for 7 days. That was only 7 days. They were told by their dispatcher, this is a just-in-time load. You need to move this thing. It's got to get to the destination. And like many over-the-road motor carriers that have trainer programs, they treat the trainer and the driver as a team, meaning that the trainer is asleep when they're in the back in the berth and the driver is operating the vehicle. But there is no way that a driver for Werner could have avoided that accident. It's impossible to predict what someone on the opposite lane is doing and then to have that catastrophic thing happen. This will impact insurance rates in everybody's balance sheets. And this case is currently on appeal to the Supreme Court of Texas, which will be the final place that the decision will come from if they uphold it or they reverse it.
And so what are your takeaways from this?
The simplest one, which is not really super newsworthy, is that don't litigate a case with a dead child. Look, I'm a lawyer. I've done cases with horrifying things. Those are cases that are very difficult to litigate. No one's going to feel sorry for you if you're a business. They're going to feel sorry for that family. We also see that as an industry, we're underinsured. Like Werner is self-insured for $10 million, and I think above that is an umbrella policy. But treating team drivers with a trainer is probably not a good business move. I think over time, we got to adjust that as an industry, but there's no margin for that. We have no margin. So
Mm-hmm.
the takeaway is like we are in a very delicate balance of, do we have enough insurance? Do we have enough training? Do we have enough people? But in the case of this one, this is one the industry has to fight for. I mean, we need to make sure well, not make sure. We need to see if they can reverse it at the Texas Supreme Court, because that kind of liability is impossible to insure for. It's bananas.
So what are the types of, like, what would be if the Supreme Court holds this, and this is the final judgment? You mentioned sort of insurance rates, probably because you get certain insurance companies. It's like insuring houses in Fort Myers. You just get out of the business, right? You don't want anything to do with it.
This industry, I mean, I'm going to do some more history stuff. So the last time we raised the rate of insurance for motor carriers to move general freight in the United States was 1980. And that number is $750,000. That is the minimum insurance required to operate a commercial vehicle in most parts of the country. $750,000 will cover maybe 3 or 4 days in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It is woefully inadequate. If we had just pegged that to inflation, that liability insurance we'd have for most motor carriers would likely be over $4 million. So the reality is, these verdicts, we call them nuclear verdicts. That's a pejorative. I don't like that term. That's not a legal term. Lawyers did not create that term. That term was created by the industry to make you go, oh my gosh, that truck accident was a lot like Nagasaki. It was a lot like Hiroshima. It's like, it's nothing like that. It's absolutely nothing. It's a very, very bad day for somebody, but it is not the same akin. But we want people to hate lawyers who do plaintiff work. But in any event, the takeaways are that if you have that kind of liability, imagine you're driving home from work and someone smashes into you from the other side of the road. You could be at fault. That's bananas. That's bananas. Yeah. So if Texas doesn't reverse this thing, I think motor carriers are going to likely move out of Texas to an extent, or they'll make far more rigorous rules of, if it's snowing, go 50 miles under the speed limit. Like, do not go 10 miles under the speed limit. But it was a very strange case, and it just kind of goes to show what is at stake in this industry. And the thing I'll leave with that as we talk about this is, if you're an owner operator with $750,000 of insurance and someone hits you, you're bankrupt. Your company is liquidated. That is the end of it. There is no pathway that you recover, even if you didn't do anything wrong.
You know, and the reality is, if you look at the startup costs for an owner operator, what are they going to do? Get a $10 million, you know, they can't afford it anyway. Like, and the insurance is so expensive, even at that threshold. It's so, it's a challenging space. And I mean, you nailed it. It's the revenue and the margins in the business don't warrant the investment into these things. So you take the risk. I mean, it goes from this business is risky on every front, isn't it? Like, physically, financially, it's packed with risks.
And it was designed that way. I mean, this is the part that I think a lot of folks kind of forget. Like, the reason deregulation happened when Jimmy Carter signed that in the United States, it was to reduce the cost of transportation by $8 billion a year in 1980. And the way that you reduce the cost of transportation is adding more competition, which ultimately means the unions get destroyed, and motor carriers that were making, you know, let's say an operating ratio of 80%, so they're making like 20% margin, they go to 95%. And like, people, they look at our space, they're like, well, how much do people make? Like, no, it's like, if you get a 95% OR, it's a pretty good year, which means like you take in $1 and you spend 95 cents and you have 5 cents left over. And that's a successful trucking company.
Yeah.
It is by design. The problems we see today are features of the supply chain, not bugs. This is intended. Whether they knew that at the time or not, it's anyone's guess, but it came off the backs of drivers, dock workers, and mechanics.
This was a super, super interesting conversation, actually, and I thought of so many things I want to talk to you about. You know, around the employee contractor regulations in California. There's so many things I want to go, like, as we're talking
AB5, baby.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, man, I want to even dig on that. So maybe we need to do like a part 2. Your enthusiasm is amazing. You can tell you do this professionally because you do some really nice voice checks here and there. But I do have sort of one follow-up question, because there are people who are watching this, and you mentioned earlier that you about maintenance, and I like this place. You sort of talk maintenance of your body. I can only see your upper half. You look like you're in great shape, and you got a black eye right now. So I've created a lot of narratives in my head around, like, this guy maybe like he fights. I don't know. Like, so what happened to you? Why do you have a black eye? People watch this. They'd kill me if I didn't ask you.
Oh, absolutely. So this is a fantastic story. So I went down to Lake Shelbyville in Illinois. We rented a house on Verbo. I had my wife and my 4 children, and the place had a little pool, a nice 6 foot deep end and it's 3 feet deep. And I love to chase my kids. I love being a monster. I love to play. This is like my exercise. I don't exercise. I have 4 children. That's what I do. And so we were in the pool. It was nighttime, and I'm getting out, and my right hand slips, and my head smashes the side of the pool, and my brow gets all banana shaped. I'm still recovering. This is 1 week ago. 1 week ago, last Monday is when I did this. And so it was a very exciting time. And I realized at 39, it's been 3 decades since I've had a black eye. So it is fundamentally a nice change of pace.
Well, it looks good on you. You're a good looking guy, and somehow it works. So, so even well done on the black eye.
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
But
Matthew. Yeah, go ahead.
But in terms of like other legal things, like my main goal in all the stuff that I do is to take things that seem inaccessibly complicated, and because it's written in a different language, like legalese is a different language. My hope, my goal is to help people understand the trends that are happening, understand what these cases are in a way that is both educational and entertaining. I love the law, and I want it to be something that anyone can access. And this supply chain, this supply web, doesn't belong to anybody. It is everybody's. And so if we see things we want to change, we can't change it until we understand it. And that's my main goal, is to help people understand what is at stake with something like an AB5 or any other broker liability things that are out there.
Well, in the hour we spent together, you've done a great job, educating me and I think the listeners. So we all appreciate your time, and thank you for this pro bono work that you gave us over the last hour. Where can folks find you?
I'm very prolific on LinkedIn. Just look up Matthew Leffler. On Twitter, it's Armchair Atty, ATTY. Why? Because ATTY is the abbreviation for the word attorney. I am not prolific on Instagram, though I am there. And I'm on TikTok. Again, not very prolific, but I am there. And then I have a podcast called Fleeting Conversations, where I interview people in the supply chain, whether it's legal or business or whatever. I just love this kind of format. It's so much fun to do.
Well, this was a lot of fun to do with you. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, be well.